Hello friend, welcome back to my channel. How are you today? I hope you're doing well. It's Tim here, and in this video I'm going to guide you through the steps to create this nighttime winter cabin scene. This is a very beginner-friendly painting as well, and we'll be covering a lot of different types of digital painting techniques in this video, so I'm super excited to share it with you. And I also wanted to thank you guys so much for all of the support and kind comments on the channel this year. It's been a lot of fun and it means so much to me. And I wanted to say happy holidays and I hope you have a wonderful new year. I meant to have this video out earlier this month, but things kind of got crazy, so I'm glad to have it finally done. I have some super fun things planned for next year for tutorials, so I can't wait for the year to come. Upcoming here are the hex codes for the palette of colors that you'll need to be able to paint along with me, as well as the main brushes. If you need the damp brush, I do have a video up on my channel on how to recreate this brush from scratch for the iPad, so if you need it, definitely go check it out. The first step of this tutorial will be to screenshot this trace outline layer and insert it into a square-sized canvas in Procreate, and then trace over it into a blank layer so you'll have a guide for your painting. Please feel free to take as many breaks as you need along the way, and when you're ready, let's begin. Alright, so to get into our tutorial, we're going to start by painting our sky, so let's turn our trace outline layer down to around 10%. Let's add a new layer and put it below the trace layer. And using the first color in the first row, let's fill in this entire background with color. Let's add a new layer, and switching over to the soft airbrush now with the paintbrush, full size and full opacity. Using the second color in the first row, let's fill in this upper third of the canvas just like this. Now using the third color in the first row, let's lay a thin little strip of this dark bluish black color at the top of the canvas just like this. Now using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 30%. Let's add a new layer and put it into overlay. Now using the fourth color in the first row, let's paint a strip of this light color in the middle of the painting. Then using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 49%. Now let's add a new layer, and then let's switch over to using the technical pen now with the paintbrush, about 52% size with full opacity. And using the first color in the first row, let's place dots over the entire sky area just like this to create some stars. And then when you're happy with your stars, let's use Hue and Saturation tool, and let's turn the brightness of the star layer down to about 46%, and then the saturation down to about 46% as well. And now let's add some highlight stars. Let's change our brush size to around 39%, still using full opacity. And still using the same color on the same layer. Let's place some more detail star dots in between the stars we just painted. And because we turned the brightness and saturation down on the ones before it, these stars will look brighter in comparison, which will create some nice dimension for our background. And when you're happy with your stars, let's create a duplicate layer of them. And on this duplicate layer, let's use Gaussian blur and blur the star layer to about 17%. Then let's merge the two layers together. And then we're going to make another duplicate of this layer, so there's going to be two of them. And using Gaussian blur on this new top duplicate layer, let's blur this layer to about 21%. Then let's merge all of our star layers together except for the trace outline layer. And that brings us to painting the mountain. Let's add a new layer, and still using the technical pen with the paintbrush, about 86% brush size with full opacity. And using the third color in the first row, let's outline the mountaintop area starting on the left side edge of the canvas and then working our way up just like this, outlining the entire mountain. And then finishing it up with the right hand side edge. And then using the same color, let's fill in the entire ground area just like this. Now I'm going to turn our trace layer up just a little bit using Hue and Saturation and then upping the brightness to around 73%. That way it's a little bit easier for us to see. Let's go back below that layer now and add a new layer. And let's zoom up here. And now using the paintbrush now with the burnt tree brush and using the first color in the second row with about 6% brush size and 81% opacity. Actually, just kidding. I'm going to turn that trace layer off for just a moment so it's easier to see the mountain. Using the first color in the second row. And now starting on the right-hand side using long sweeping paint strokes from left to right and from top to bottom, let's start adding color to the right side of the mountain, allowing for darker spaces to still show through in between and kind of allowing the brush to skip a little bit here and there, leaving a little bit of dark texture in between. And then for the areas closer to the middle and the bottom that need smaller areas of color, I'm kind of using a short zigzag scribble paint stroke, still making sure they're going from left to right and really allowing a little bit of that dark color to still show through the texture, just like this. And then I'm just repeating the same paint strokes for the bottom middle area that needs smaller amounts of color towards the bottom. And the key to get them to still look like mountains is to make sure that the dark spaces are not super symmetrical looking. That will create a much more realistic look. It's okay if they look kind of rough or off to the side or kind of ragged. If the lines going down are too diagonal or too straight, your mountains will read as more of a pyramid shape rather than a mountain. So making sure each area stays random, even if it's just adding a couple of additional paint strokes here or there or leaving bigger spaces open too, would definitely help. And on the same layer, let's switch over to using the second color in the first row. And now working from right to left with the same sweeping paint strokes, let's fill in some of these shadow areas just like this. Now I'm going to shrink my brush size just a little bit, around 3% or so, that way it's a little easier to fill in the smaller spaces with. Still leaving a little bit of that dark color around the edges. This will create a much more realistic looking peak for your mountain. And we're going to continue filling in some of the shadowed areas. And when you're happy with your mountain color, let's turn the opacity of this layer down to about 54%. And then let's add a new layer. And let's switch over to using the second color in the second row. And let's shrink our brush size down to around 3% and then the opacity down to about 69%. And now using the same sweeping paint strokes on the right side from left to right, from top to bottom, let's add some snow highlight to the right side of the mountain, just like this. And this is an area to make big decisions with too. Every once in a while, I am also adding in a small zigzag scribble here and there, just to kind of shake it up a little bit. Just making sure to allow the brush to skip a little bit here and there to allow some of the darker texture underneath to still show through. And then we're going to work our way to the next peak and repeat the same steps, really highlighting that right-hand side and adding just a little bit over here just to indicate a little bit of highlight. And when you're happy with your highlight, I'm going to turn the opacity of this layer down to around 49%. Now let's add a new layer, and still using the same color, let's start adding a smaller amount of this bright snow highlight closer to just the peaks now of each of the mountains, just like this. And this is adding just a very small amount of this highlight color to the top just to kind of brighten it up a little bit. And you can really have fun with this too. You can create some really beautiful detail effects with this, so make sure to have fun with it. I'm also adding in that little zigzag stroke here and there too. And when you're happy with your highlight, let's turn this layer's opacity down to around 84%. And then let's merge all of our mountain layers back together, but don't merge it into the background layer. Now let's create a duplicate of this mountain layer. And on the duplicate layer, using the first color in the first row, we're going to do something a little crazy. Let's color drop this blue periwinkle color onto the mountain copy layer on top. So now we have a blue mountain. And you're probably thinking, what on earth are you doing? But this is my absolute favorite way to help mountain colors and textures blend in with the background we've created. Let's turn this blue mountain layer's opacity down quite a bit to around 16%, which will create a really beautiful blue tone mountain now with textures that match a bit better to the background. And then let's merge the two mountain layers back together. And now let's switch over to using the eraser tool with the technical pen. And using full size and full opacity, let's lightly carve out the edges of our mountain now, cleaning up any overhang from the snow into the sky area. And you can really have some fun here carving out the edges and sharpening up those points just like this. And then we're going to repeat this step along the edge of the mountain, working our way from left to right. When you're happy with your mountain edge, let's add a new layer, and then let's switch over to using the paintbrush now with the first color in the first row. And with the paintbrush, let's use the soft airbrush. Using the airbrush with about 51% brush size and full opacity, let's paint a thin line of color at the base of the mountain, just like this. And then using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 32%. And then let's turn the opacity of this layer down to around 68%. Which will create a really beautiful fog effect for the base of the mountain. And that brings us to painting the background trees. Let's add a new layer and switch over to using the paintbrush now with full size and full opacity. And using the 6th color in the first row, let's paint a straight line across the middle of the painting just like this. And then let's fill it in. Now using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to around 24%. Let's turn the trace outline layer back on. And then I'm going to turn the trace layer up just a little bit to like 23% just so we can see it better. Now going back down to the ground layer we just created and blurred, let's switch over to using the water pen now with the paintbrush, about 9% brush size and full opacity. And over the trace outline area of the trees, using up and down zigzag cross-hatching paint strokes, starting on the left-hand side and working our way across the outline like this, let's paint our trees. Just making sure to vary our paint stroke heights here and there to indicate smaller and taller trees within it. And when you reach the right-hand side, let's up our brush size just a little bit and fill in the rest, connecting it to the bottom and filling in any open spaces. Now using the 5th color in the first row and shrinking our brush size back down between 10 and 20%, let's add just a little bit of this new highlight color just along the top edge of the trees using the same paint strokes. Let's turn the trace outline layer off, and then let's switch over to using the blending tool now with the water pen, about 10% brush size with full opacity. And using the same up and down zigzag paint strokes, let's lightly blend out the top edge of the row of trees just like this, working our way from left to right. And when you reach the right-hand side, we're going to put another layer of trees in, so still on that same layer, we're going to move down just a little bit on the left side. And using the same zigzag paint strokes, we're going to drag some of this darker color over the top of the lighter trees, just like this. And then working down the row. And then we're going to repeat the same step again, dragging some of this bottom color over the top to create the illusion of another row of trees in front. So this is the 3rd and final step. Now let's turn our trace layer outline back on. And now it's time to paint the moon. Let's add a new layer. Let's use the technical pen now using full size and full opacity. Using the 4th color in the first row, and let's paint a circle over top of the moon outline just like this. And let's hold it down, tapping the screen at the end to get a perfect circle. And then let's fill in the shape. Let's create a duplicate layer of the moon now, and then using Gaussian blur on the duplicate layer, let's blur this new layer to about 37%. Let's create another copy of the moon layer and blur this new copy layer to around 35%, which creates a nice little glow for our moon. Now let's merge our moon layers back together. And that brings us to painting the snow. Let's add a new layer and switch over to using the damp brush with the paintbrush, about 4% brush size and full opacity, against the back layer of trees on the hill area, using the 1st color in the 2nd row. Using long, back and forth sweeping paint strokes from left to right, let's slowly fill in this back hill area of snow just like this. And then let's turn the opacity of this layer down to around 42%. Then let's add a new layer and up the brush size to around 4% with 74% opacity. And still using the first color in the second row, let's lay a little bit more of this highlight color over the top, still using the long sweeping paint strokes like before, allowing just a little bit of that shadow color still to show through though. Now let's add a new layer. Still using the damp brush with the paintbrush, about 85% opacity with 6% brush size. Using the first color in the second row still, and using long sweeping paint strokes again, working from left to right and back and forth. Let's paint over our front hill area with snow, just like this. And the damp brush is set to trail off just a little bit the longer the paint stroke goes, so by not picking up the brush as much, it will cause it to get a little bit less opaque, which will really help you in creating shadows towards the bottom here and create a really nice gradient for painting with. When you're happy with your snow, let's turn this layer's opacity down to around 58%. Let's add a new layer and change the brush size to around 5% with 71% opacity. And let's add another highlight layer of snow over the top of this area, still using our long sweeping paint strokes. And I'm starting on the left-hand side, working our way up to the pathway, but being careful not to completely cross over the path, still allowing that area to be dark. And when I've got that area filled in, I'm going to switch over to the right-hand side now and filling in the right-hand side in the same way. Only on this side, once I have it filled in, I'm going to cross onto the pathway area, allowing just a little bit of the darkness still to show through a little bit. And then let's switch over to using the blending tool now with the damp brush, about 9% brush size and 25% opacity. Still using the same long sweeping paint strokes, let's lightly blend out this entire area. Just kind of softening it up a little bit, not completely blending away all of the shadow. And when you're happy with your blending, let's merge the snow layers together, and then let's add a new layer. And using the second color in the second row, let's switch over to using the paintbrush now again with the damp brush, about 4% brush size and 56% opacity. And let's start on the left-hand side again and repeat the same steps and add some more snow highlight to the snow. And bringing the highlight right up to the edge of the pathway, just like before, but not completely crossing over it, leaving just a little bit of it in shadow. And then switching over to the right-hand side and repeating the same, working our way up to the left side edge of the path, allowing just a little bit to cross over onto the path, but not as much as before. And when you're happy with your snow, let's switch over to the blending tool now with the same settings, and let's lightly blend it out again. Which brings us to painting the cabin. Let's switch over to using the paintbrush again with the technical pen, full size and full opacity, using the fifth color in the second row. And let's add a new layer, but we're going to put it over top of the trace outline layer so it's a little bit easier to see, just like this. And then let's begin outlining the entire edge of the cabin, just like this, connecting each side together. And to get a straight line, paint a line and then hold it down, and that will autocorrect the shape for you. And if you have really wiggly hands like me, this will be a really great tool for you. And then we're going to outline the front porch outline just like this. And then using the fourth color in the second row, let's color drop and fill in the roof. And then using the fifth color in the second row, let's fill in the sides. And now we're going to move this layer below the trace outline layer again so it's easier to see. Let's add a new layer. Let's turn off the trace outline layer and switch over to using the water pen now. About 15% brush size and full opacity. And using the first color in the second row, let's add a line of snow on the left-hand side roof edge just like this, along the top, the right side edge, and then the bottom. And then we're going to trace over the far right-hand side roof edge just like this. And then along the front porch roof rail. And now let's switch over to using the blending tool again with the damp brush, about 4% brush size with 58% opacity. And using up and down paint strokes, top to bottom and back and forth, let's lightly blend the snow onto the roof area just like this. When you're happy with your blending, let's switch back over to the water pen again with the paintbrush with the same settings and same color. And I'm going to re-outline each side of the roof again just to kind of clean it up a little bit. And then I'm going to add some snow over the left-hand side edge of the building at the bottom here. Let's turn the trace outline layer back on. And it was here I actually forgot a step, so I'm sorry about that. Let's add a new layer and put it below the snow layer that we just added. Using the water pen with the paintbrush, about 10% brush size, full opacity, and using the 6th color in the second row, let's paint straight vertical lines with a space in between on the left-hand side of the cabin like this. And then repeating these lines in the same way, leaving a space in between them on the right-hand side of the cabin. And then let's switch over to using the blending tool now with the damp brush, about 3% brush size and about 51% opacity, and let's lightly blend them out. I was looking at it and I was thinking, I think something's missing here. Oops. And then let's turn the opacity of this layer down to around 73% once it's blended. Let's add a new layer and switch over to using the paintbrush again with the water pen, about 10% brush size with full opacity. And using the first color in the third row, let's fill in the window spaces just like this with color. And then using the second color in the third row, let's place a little bit of light in the middle of each window just like this. Let's turn off the trace outline layer now. And let's switch over to using the blending tool with the damp brush, about 2% brush size and 50% opacity. And let's blend out the colors together in each window. Now let's switch over to using the water pen with the blending tool, about 4% brush size with full opacity. And grabbing the color from around the outside of each edge, let's paint a straight vertical line downwards, grabbing a little bit of that brown color into the center of each window. And then let's paint a little horizontal line in the same manner across the middle. And then along the outsides of each window, let's blend and create a windowsill just like this along each side. And this is created by blending both the yellow and brown color together on the outside edge together, which will create kind of a middle brown color. And I'm going back and forth to grab the colors and pull them together. And we're going to repeat this across each window. Now let's merge all of our cabin layers together, including the windows. And now let's add some Christmas lights. Let's add a new layer, and let's switch over to using the paintbrush now with the technical pen, about 61% brush size with full opacity. And using the second color in the third row, and let's place some dots of multiple sizes along the bottom edge of the roof, just like this. Kind of randomizing the number of dots and where they're placed, making some closer and some further away from each other. And then we're going to continue the same step along the top edge of the roof. And then down the bottom edge, and then across the front porch, and then down the railing. And then I'm going to turn this layer's opacity down just a little bit to like 30% so they're just barely visible. Let's add a new layer and switch over to using the paintbrush now with the light pen, about 19% brush size with full opacity. And using the first color in the third row, let's add some more dots in between each of the dots we just placed, just like this, kind of just filling them in a little bit more and making them look more dense. And the more random you make the placement, the better they're going to look. And then we're just going to repeat this down the bottom edge of the roof and across the porch and the railing again. Then let's turn the original light layer back up, which gives us some really cute Christmas lights. Now it's time to paint the special effects. Let's add a new layer and put it into overlay. Let's switch over to using the light pen now with about 50% brush size and full opacity, using the fourth color in the first row now. And let's paint some highlight color underneath of the cabin, just a little bit outwards and then going away from each window like this. And then let's put some of this highlight color in the windows and along the bottom edge of the lights. And then using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 30%. Now let's add a new layer and put it into soft light. Now let's switch over to using the paintbrush with the soft airbrush using full size and full opacity. Let's use the third color in the first row. And let's paint a stripe of color on the left-hand side and then curve the bottom edge. Let's paint it on the right-hand side and curve the bottom edge. And then let's connect the two. Then using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 40%. And then let's turn the opacity of this layer down to around 57%. Let's add a new layer and repeat the same, painting a stripe of color on the left-hand side, only just a little bit thinner now than before, and curving the edges of the bottom still. And then we're going to repeat that same on the right-hand side and connecting the two at the bottom. Then we're going to use Gaussian blur again and blur this layer to around 18%. And then we're going to turn the opacity of this layer down to around 31%. Let's create a copy canvas layer and put it on the top. And then let's create a duplicate of it. Let's put the duplicate layer into black and white using hue and saturation. Let's add a new layer, and on the top of these two layers, let's put it into overlay. Now using the fourth color in the first row, with the damp brush and the paintbrush, about 8% brush size and 68% opacity. Now let's add a little bit of highlight underneath of the cabin coming out from the windows and up to the pathway, but not crossing over it, leaving it dark, just like this. And then we're going to repeat the same on the right-hand side, going up to the edge of the path. And then let's add a little bit of this highlight color to the lake area as well. And then we're going to make our size just a little bit smaller to around 3%. And we're going to add just a little bit of highlight to the back area of snow. And then let's add a little bit of highlight to the roof of the cabin. And I'm just kind of reinforcing that right side edge of the hill with just a little more color. And when you're happy with your highlights, I'm going to turn the opacity of this layer down to around 65%. And then I'm going to turn the black and white layer off. Now let's switch over to using the blending tool now with the damp brush. Let's do around 7% brush size and around 41% opacity. And let's lightly blend out all of our highlights, just kind of lightly softening them up, marrying them in with the rest of the colors. And I'm going to get rid of the black and white layer now and create another copy canvas layer. And on this copy canvas layer, using the blending tool now, still with the damp brush, about 3% brush size and 41% opacity. And now we're going to lightly blend and soften up all of our details up in the background on this new layer, not really changing too much or blending anything away. We're just kind of softening up any harsh brush strokes just to make our snow look really smooth. Now we're going to repeat the same step on the front snow now. Now let's add a new layer and put that layer into hard light. Let's use the light flare brush now from the luminance section, using about 30% brush size and full opacity. And let's place one light flare over top of the moon, just like this. Then using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 8%. Which brings us to adding the finishing touches to our painting. Let's merge our light flare layer onto our copy canvas layer. And now let's switch over to using the water pen with the blending tool, about 6% brush size with full opacity. And let's paint some grass-like strokes in the corner, kind of indicating some longer grass sticking up that's been covered by snow. And now we're going to put a couple around the edge of the cabin, just like this. And then we're going to put some on the right-hand side of the painting at the bottom. Now let's add a new layer and switch over to using the paintbrush now with the damp brush. Using the third color in the second row and using about 3% brush size and 40% opacity. Starting on the right-hand side, we're going to use side-to-side sweeping paint strokes to kind of indicate some highlight on top of the snow, just like this. Really allowing the snow that's underneath still to show through, just kind of as a shadow. You don't want this new color to kind of overtake it too much. And I'm kind of curving it towards the pathway, but I'm not covering the path with it yet. And then I'm going to repeat this same step now on the left-hand side, working our way up to the path, just curving into it a little bit. And now that I have the left-hand side done, I'm going to lightly drag some of the snow highlight color over top of the pathway, but very minimally and only in a couple of places here and there. Still really allowing that dark color still to show through, really just giving the pathway a little bit more texture and kind of tying it all together. Now let's switch over to the blending tool now with the damp brush, about 6% brush size and 33% opacity. And let's lightly blend it out, just kind of softening all of our textures up, not completely blending it away though. And when you're happy with your blending, let's add a new layer and put that layer into overlay. Now using the fourth color in the first row, let's repeat the same step as before. And we're going to start underneath of the cabin window, adding just a little bit more snow highlight there and then kind of dragging it out to the other windows. And then we're going to drag it down, just brightening the snow up a little bit more altogether. And then we're going to repeat this on the right-hand side as well, only closer to the pathway area, kind of leaving that far right-hand side area in shadow untouched. Then let's add just a little bit more to the back area snow and over top of the pond area, just like this. And now I'm going to add just a little bit more highlight color here just around the edges of the pathway to kind of give the snow a little bit more shape and to add a little bit more brightness. And then we're going to put just a little bit more highlight under the window. I wanted it to be just a little bit brighter right there. Now switching over to the blending tool now with the damp brush, about 10% brush size and about 26% opacity. Let's lightly buff and blend out this area, just kind of softening and marrying all of our new highlights together with the background. Finally, let's add a new layer and put it into add mode. Let's switch over to using the light pen now, about 22% brush size with full opacity. And let's add a glow in the center of each of the windows, just like this. Then using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 14%. And now let's turn the opacity of this layer down to about 38%, and we're done. Now let's sign our painting. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this painting tutorial, and I hope you had fun painting. If you're on Instagram and recreated this painting, I would absolutely love to see it, so please tag me at Timstar Studio. If you're still in a painting mood, I do have a variety of different painting tutorials now up on my channel, so definitely go check those out. And as always, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, I invite you to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps my channel out. And until next time, friend, happy painting.